Welcome to this introduction discussion on Lorraine Hansberry's 1970 play, Les Blancs. I'm joined today by Dawn Walton, the founder and former artistic director and chief executive of Eclipse Theatre, where she developed and directed the groundbreaking Revolution mixed plays, and Tobi Kyeremateng, who is a freelance award-winning cultural producer and social entrepreneur with a focus on creating rich cultural experiences and sustainable social change. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being here. Dawn, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and just ask you to give us some kind of context on Lorraine Hansberry and Les Blancs, because I know you have directed probably her most famous play, which is Raisin in the Sun. So how does that all connect together, and what does that say to you?
I'm going to do my fangirl bit now. This
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I'm a massive fan of Lorraine Hansberry, and I guess as a result, I sort of came to this play, Les Blancs, there are three key moments I would identify that this play came up in particular for me. So the first time was, I was in a bookshop years ago, 2000, looking for secondhand plays, which is what I always do. Came across this play called Les Nègres. Now, apart from all the expletives that came out of my mouth, because I was like, what is this? Genet's play. I had no idea about this play, I knew nothing about it. So I started to kind of work with it and work out what it was about, what it was trying to do, and what is this? And an extraordinary opportunity came along to from the young Vic to do it and explore it in a workshop director's award. So I did it. And in the course of my research, I became aware of the fact that there was a play by Lorraine Hansberry called Les Blancs. I then saw later on the year, I saw Raisin in the Sun for the first time in my life. I'd never seen that play before. And it kind of broke me, and that introduced me to the character of Beneatha. And in Beneatha, who Hansberry openly sort of admitted that was really based on her, was the character that was closest to her. Beneatha has two suitors, and she has sort of George, the sort of all-American, sort of fully assimilated, kind of middle-class African-American, and then there's Assegai, who's her other suitor, who's from an African country. I think it's Nigeria. I can't remember if Nigeria is actually mentioned now. It's gone out of my head, but certainly an African country, and actually was really a demonstration of part of the conversation that Hansberry herself was involved with, the Pan-African conversation. And part of the deal of the proposal would be that if she accepted the proposal, she herself, Beneatha, would go to Africa. Many years later, I had the pleasure of and the joy of finally, at long last, directing Raisin in the Sun. And I did a massive tour of it, and it was really quite an extraordinary experience to get to work that closely and live with Hansberry for a year or so, listening to her recordings, hearing her talking about work. I've never heard her talk about this play for very obvious reasons, because unfortunately she passed away before it was produced. So I don't have that immediate insight, but to sort of hear her thinking and her talking around many of the topics I think that come up was really helpful, certainly for me when I was directing Raisin in the Sun. But as we finished, an extraordinary thing happened. When I was touring Raisin in the Sun, it was the first time there had been, because it's not really done that often, despite people thinking it is done. It's not really directed that often in this country. It's done a lot in America, but not in Europe. And there happened to be 3 productions of Raisin in the Sun. So there was my own production with Eclipse, and then there was a production in Sweden, and there was a production in the Netherlands. And so we were all sort of talking to each other on Twitter, which was beautiful. And, you know, and all having this extraordinary moment of this incredible play and this incredible exploration. And then this invitation, as we finished, an invitation landed, and it was from the Lorraine Hansberry Society. And they had invited all of us to meet in London to see this production, which was Les Blancs. And that's kind of my full journey, if you like. And actually seeing having just worked with Lorraine's first piece and then finishing that and arriving down in London to see her final piece was quite, it kind of finished the journey in a sense for us. We had a sense of things in Raisin, and it kind of gets realised fully in this play, Le Blanc.
Yeah, it's where things land.
It's where it all landed, it's where she headed. The thesis had continued and actually got to a really good place back in Africa. Yeah, do you want to say more than that?
No, that's a fantastic introduction for us, and really great at contextualizing, and establishing Les Blancs as Lorraine's final piece, though it was unfinished at the point of her death. And I think it was her husband who, helped, rewrite or finish, and then it was reworked again for this production, I believe, with another dramaturg. But I'd like to bring you in at this point, Tobi, because obviously the thing about plays is obviously they don't carry a certification, or usually they don't. But if you take in Le Blanc, if you were to give it a certification, what would you say about the content of the play? Bearing in mind, of course, this is a pre-show introduction to the play, so no spoilers if you can avoid them at all.
So Le Blanc was the first play that I saw at the National, actually, and it was a hard watch, I think, for me, a really difficult watch. There was so much about it that I loved, in terms of it's just sort of like forwardness, and it's sort of like honesty of like that particular civilization, and I guess like the effects and the ramifications of colonialism, essentially, and a kind of South African apartheid. But it is hard to sort of like look at that legacy, I guess, on stage. And so I guess there's a caution, I guess, like a caution of care, I guess, like going into watching the show, that I guess I wish I was given when I went to see it at the time. But I am glad that I did see it, though.
Yeah.
So it's not something to sort of shy away from, but I guess there is like a caution of care that should be taken.
Yeah. And I know it's difficult because obviously you don't want to give too much away. But I guess, I suppose, as I say, the whole discussion is built all around the framework of trauma. And do you think that's a fair thing of us to do, in just terms of, I mean, I obviously don't know the true impact of the play on you, or you, Dawn, for that matter. But, as I say, certainly I'm conscious of the role of trauma in the Black experience, basically. And I wonder what role this play plays within that.
I think what's really interesting about the play is that it sits in that, in a couple of triangles, isn't it? As the Le Blanc has the sort of the transatlantic slave triangle. So you have America, you have Africa, you have the Europeans in Africa, and you have this American voyeur who arrives, if you like, journalist who arrives to kind of be in that world. So we set that up, and we know at that point that no good will come here, because we're already in that place. And then you've also, because you're in the place now of the other triangle, which is kind of imperialism, colonialism, and racism. Those three things are all playing out in this piece. I think, I spent quite a lot of time actually thinking about this in relation to the Blacks, actually, interestingly, which deals with trauma in a really tricky way, I think. I think both plays have a great deal of trauma just by the very nature of the subject matter. You're not going to not have a narrative of trauma in a colonialistic setup. It's impossible. But but it's how it's handled in each piece. And there's something extraordinary about the way that it's handled in the Le Negre, the blacks, in that it is almost absurd and it is focused in on in lots of ways. It's a ritual. Genet makes a big deal about it being for, he writes this preface that talks about it being for a white audience, etc. It's been interesting reading the reviews of the original production of Les Blancs in the 60s, I think it was, and there's a lot of talking about the audience, which I think is something that I recognise. And I was like, wow, people are really uncomfortable, so they're going to talk about the audience and talk about people, you know, applauding and black audiences applauding, etc. In it, which I think was really telling. I think I've had a few reviews like that myself, where people can't talk about the subject because it's too awful, so they actually talk about the audience and the audience response to it. But I think it's, I think the violence when it comes is really shocking, and there isn't any warning. There's a tension that suddenly starts to build when you realise. I guess there's one key moment I would talk about, but I wouldn't talk about now because I'm not going to spoil it for you. But there is a key moment that you should prepare yourself for. I think that is really shocking. But there is a kind of constant references all the way through that are said really casually, and you just kind of go, what do you mean? And that's what's really that's more shocking in a sense, the casualness of the comments of the mostly white community that we're seeing here based around this mission.
And I'll go on, Toby. What do you want to come in on that?
I guess it's also like it's interesting, like all the reviews kind of focusing in on the audience as opposed to the work. And I think, you know, when we talk about trauma and we talk about like the consumption of it, I guess it's like, who is that show traumatic for? Like, really? And I guess that, you know, this will be a different experience because people are watching it in their own homes as opposed to sitting in an auditorium. And I think that will definitely change. Like the experience of kind of watching it again definitely felt really different for me watching it this time in my house as opposed to like sitting at the National. But even, I guess like even watching them kind of, you were able to still sort of like sense those moments of like tension within the audience and like the different laughter points as well, and kind of like referencing how I felt back to sitting in that auditorium. I'm hearing people laugh at those particular areas. And how that also like influences the way that we are like consuming the work that we're seeing. And so it's I will always sort of ask like, who is this work going to be traumatic for?
I mean, it's fascinating talking about it today in this context that we're in right now, because it's the thing about knowing the history and understanding the histories, isn't it? And if you don't, it's a really difficult piece to watch because it just feels, it can feel quite violent. And you also you have to listen really hard because there are things that are coming up and there are contradictions and there are nuances in it. And I think that Hansberry was really trying to unpick a lot of these arguments. You know, it's not as clear as you're American or you're Pan-African. Do you know what I mean? It's not that simple. Or you're European. There's lots of complexities in terms of people talking about that place. Because I don't think it's country specific, that talks about that place in Africa. Everybody's talking about it as their home and what that ownership is and how that's being negotiated, and therefore what rights people have to be violent, if you like, to protect, to respond, to react, and or to take, you know, what those violences are. And I think that's really... that's a lot, I think, to kind of take on in one piece. And it was interesting seeing it for the second time because I did watch it in the audience. I was curious, actually, Toby, what the difference was. If you're going to sort of really, for me, I was curious as to what you thought the difference was watching it in the space and then watching it in your own space, if you like, at home, what the difference was for you in terms of that experience.
I feel like, I don't know, a part of me feels like when I was watching it at the National, I don't know, I felt quite naive in that space, in a sense.
Right.
And I guess there's, you know, in my own home, there are certain like comforts around me. There are certain things that I can sort of identify as things that belong to me. And like, I'm able to sort of like build that into the environment that I'm creating to kind of like consume that work. Whereas like when I'm walking into a building like the National for the first time, which is like huge, and I'm like, I've already gotten lost like 3 times before I've even gotten into the auditorium. And then I'm in this auditorium and I'm looking around me and like everyone's white and I'm about to watch this show. It's like interrogating whiteness in a very specific way. And, you know, I was very aware of myself in that space. In sort of like the stuff that was happening on stage, the stuff that, you know, was being laughed at around me, and having to be like, am I just not getting it, to like not be laughing along with these people, or actually am I just experiencing it in such a different way? And so it's like while I'm watching the work, I'm also like questioning so many bits of the work, bits of myself, bits of the audience, you know, bits of like my entire, and that informs my entire experience of. Whereas some people are probably able to see the work and be like, okay, cool. And then like go home and like, that was it. Whereas like, that was just like the aftermath of that, of, you know, the next day and talking to people about it and asking myself lots of different questions. Like it really stuck with me for a long time. Whereas I feel like at home, I guess I was able to, I mean, I've already seen it, so I was able to prepare and sort of like set myself up. But I was just comfortable. And I guess like that also made me more confident in the way that I was interrogating the work that I was seeing, and not sort of like gaslighting myself and saying, oh, actually it's probably not that, or it's probably different, or I'm not understanding this. And yeah, it felt really different kind of watching it again.
I mean, I think it's fascinating what you're picking up on there, Tobi, in the sense of the whole audience experience and the theatre going experience, and that is, you know, we traditionally regard it as a communal activity or a community activity, and that we regard the audience as just being this amorphous, you know, singular mass of people who are all going to receive it all in the same way, you know, whatever is on the stage. Tobi, would you say it is an important play? This play? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. I feel like so much, for me anyway, like so much of what I learned from the play was also like the research around it, and like more research into like that particular play, more research into like Lorraine's wider discography of work as well. And I feel like when, and I guess that also depends on, like, not everyone does that, but I think for me, like, I learned so much just from like coming out of that and saying, okay, actually, like, these are things that I want to probe deeper into, and I want to know more about. And I think it's sort of like twofold, isn't it? Because it's sort of like, you don't necessarily want to sort of leave Black audience members traumatized, that kind of like seeing this like resurge of like trauma on stage, of very, very real stuff that happens and has happened and is happening. But there are also specific stories that need to be told, because otherwise they just don't get told at all. And we can't sort of wait and rely on other people to maybe tell them. And even though they do kind of carry trauma, they contextualize the world that we live in currently. And so I think for me, you know, I guess that as a young person, I think at the time I was a teenager when I saw it, and it really sort of like begun a lot of the work that I needed to do to look into like apartheid specifically, and to look into like colonialism specifically, and to really like build that bank of knowledge to be able to just like contextualize the world that I was existing in. And so I do feel like that piece of work and work like that is important in that contextualizing, but then it's also about, you know, how do we bring that context forward into like the present day, and how do we, because so much of like this kind of work is also like, oh, it was so long ago, and things are so different now, which is, you know, it's not necessarily the case. There's an evolution like what we're seeing. It hasn't just disappeared out of thin air. And so I think it's also like, how do you kind of pair it with the context of the present day and the sort of like the futures and the dreaming and the imagining of what the future could possibly look like for people that are, I guess, constantly working around how to like dismantle all of these institutional systems that we're living in as well.
Yeah, great. And were you surprised on how much the play did resonate with today?
Yeah, I mean, it is around the traumatic moments, though, I think, and that's what's really shocking about it. I mean, I've been pretty isolated. I'm still in isolation here, but I spent a lot of time over the last few weeks avoiding images, the shocking images. I've told you that I didn't watch the film of George Floyd's death for some time. I kind of avoided it, and the news was really hard to watch. I had to go to radio news because every minute it was being flashed up, and those images are so. The image of it is so difficult to process. It's and so. Yeah, and there's, it is being flashed up on TV with no real care at all. It's just no thought at all. It's just a piece of news footage. So I didn't watch the full thing. I did watch it. I made myself watch it. I prepared myself, and much like you, I put things around me and made myself watch it because I felt a responsibility to bear witness. And that came after I heard, interestingly, Ava DuVernay talking about why that film... why now, why this moment has sort of escalated. And I think we mustn't ignore that we're in pandemic, and there is something about the space that we're in right now when we're able to receive things because we're not got all the distractions, if you like. But aside from that, she talked about it, interestingly, as a filmmaker, and talked about the framing of it and what you could see, and the fact that you could see both George Floyd and the officer. And usually when you see that sort of footage, you don't see the officer at all. You're getting it off a cam. You're sort of seeing some sort of, stuff, and you're seeing the trauma, but no, not the perpetrator, to use that kind of language. And so there's something about the fact that it was perfectly framed. You could see both. And so I felt responsibility to watch in that moment, and I haven't watched it again since, although it still is very, very difficult because it's, as you say, a very long time. And there is something that actually I recognised in this piece that were not dissimilar in lots of ways. Not the same action in exactly the same way, but there is something about the passiveness and the sort of casualness of some, certainly in one moment, that my head flipped straight back to that film footage that I had seen, that news footage that I'd seen, that phone footage that I'd seen but a week beforehand. When I watched it again, it did flip back, and there is something about that. And also the movement generally, as I said earlier, about understanding where this is coming from. It takes it right the way back. And you can see all of colonialism being played out right there in the play. And it's really important, I think, to understand that. The only thing I would say as a British person is that it's sort of coming in via an American veil, and there is something that's interesting, the Europeans and the Americans, and there is something that's different and the same that's also being played out, and that's got to be worth a conversation as well. We're doing a similar thing there, and that's the difference. And what I'm interested in myself always is the immediacy of the British experience, because the veil is the trigger, if you like. We understand that there are things that happen in America that also happen here, but actually most people don't understand what's happening here because it plays out in a slightly different way. It plays out in a very different way. It's terribly British, the way it plays out here. And yes, and so therefore people are less aware. So that's what politically where I'm at the moment. I'm more interested in the sort of direct British culpability, that line, and following that line down. Hence the whole of Revolution Mix, that whole series, and The Gift. That's what that was about. Those looking at those things.
Sure. sure. And Tobi, do you think, I mean, you know, taking Les Blancs as an example as well, but maybe being more expansive in terms of what the answer might be. But in terms, do you think that these stories, such as Les Blancs or others, can play a part in the process of processing the trauma? Let's put it that way.
I don't know. I feel like, you know, like you said, like this play has existed since the 60s. And I wonder, you know, people that watched it have watched it years ago. I wonder how they feel now. I wonder, you know, how that play might have or might not have influenced certain things in their life, influenced the way that they now look at kind of race and racism and anti-blackness. It's really difficult because I guess, like, whenever we hear people talk about like the theatrical form, we always, you know, there are lots of words that come up, like escapism and you know, debate and learning and all of this kind of stuff, right? And I guess, you know, for a particular audience, you can go and see work like Les Blancs, you can go and see a Nocturne, you can go and see Appropriate, and that is your escapism, because that reality does not exist for you outside of that space. In that space, you can be sort of challenged, but there is not really any accountability outside of that space for certain audience members. Whereas, like, when I'm going into these spaces, you know, I left my house being black, I'm in this space and I'm black, I'm leaving and I'm going home and I'm black, and that is sort of like my recurring reality. And so I wonder, like, what are the ways to like hold those people accountable for like doing any of that work once they leave the space. And I think for some people it might sort of be like seeing the show was enough. It's like, oh, I went to see this show and I learned about these things and that's the work. But actually the work is so much more personal. There needs to be a willingness there to like want to further that work outside of the theatrical space. And there's just no way of like knowing. But, you know, I as a black person was like, cool, I need to now go and do my research on colonialism and apartheid, and I need to I need to build that knowledge for myself. And it's difficult to know like how many people leave that space and like do that work afterwards.
Yeah, that's always, I mean, that's brilliant. It's brilliant. But, you know, what I say is brilliant. And of course, that is the challenge of theatre, isn't it? That is the actual challenge of it, I think, that we never know. But we always hope, we thrive to make that change. And I think, you know, there's no better argument for sitting in the same room as somebody else who has a completely different view, you know, of that piece, and other than to feel, you can feel people's reactions around you, you know, so there is something, it's really wonderful to see, you know, this kind of work in the current climate that we are in, the current pandemic, and the opportunity to see work like this is really important. But there is something extraordinary about that live experience that gives you a better chance of changing a mindset or opening a veil, or, you know, removing a veil in that live space next to somebody else. And that's the sort of thing that we're really, you know, going to struggle with now for a while. And that's the thing that I'm missing.
Yeah. And really, I think this is a final question to you both. And I put it to you as practitioners and creators and producers. In terms of care, which is something you alluded to earlier, Dawn, going forward, how do you think we should weave that care into our stories and into the work that we make, sort of, whilst also acknowledging, which is what I've heard today, of course, the importance of telling a story like Le Blanc tells, because there's future generations coming through who have no idea. You know, it's often their first introduction to a truth about the world. Yeah. Does that sit as a question?
Yeah. Well, there's two things. It depends who's telling the story, doesn't it? That really matters. who tells the story, who is the playwright, and what their own lived experience is. And it also matters who the director is. I think those things matter hugely in terms of how that care is taken. I'll go back to Jenny again. There is something extraordinary about that play and the forwarding and centering of something. Actually, there is very little care in that piece, in a sense, because it's about the shock and the aesthetic and those things. And there's something much deeper, I think, going on with LeBlanc, and thank goodness that exists. But there'll be something much deeper for a contemporary audience, or a younger audience again, that LeBlanc is a starting point, but there'll be something else. But the key things and the key way to do that is to make sure that you have Black writers, and to make sure that if you're gonna talk about trauma of Black bodies, then you've got to have Black writers, and you've got to have Black directors and Black creatives making that work, because we will put that care in. Without having to, justify it in any particular way. It just is. And that's what I think is particularly important. I don't care what the size of the space is. Bigger the better, as far as I'm
I was going to say, what kind of space have you got in mind when you say big?
Very, very big one.
You saw LeBlanc was placed. Tobi, anything that you'd like to add to that? Mainly as a producer, I guess, as well. Does that influence the work that you get involved with, the kind of work that you're going to do going forward? Tobi?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as a half my job as a producer is asking questions, to be honest. And so, when I sort of see a show that is about Black life or Black trauma, and it's written by a white person and directed by a white person, I'm like, why do you want to tell this story so bad? Why would you want to inflict this on people? And I think that it's really important to ask those questions back. I think it's also about balance. I think when we kind of talk about futures, and we're doing this work to sort of, in the hopes of dismantling, this white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, what do those futures look like? And I think, the balance of having more work alongside this contextual, this contextual work, to sort of say, well, this is what a world could look like if it centered us, is also really important, and allowing Black creators to have that freedom to be able to do that dreaming and imagining on the stage. I feel like there's an incredible platform to be able to do that, and to really do that imagining and saying, actually, if there was a world that existed that centered us, this is what that would look like. And I don't know how often we go into a space like that and see that. And so I think it's also about that balance of building the context, but also being able to do the imagining and do the dreaming beyond that context as well.
Great, that's fantastic words from both of you there. And for those of you watching this discussion, I hope that we've given you enough context for you to do the imagining as you watch LeBlanc, and I hope you get lots from it to take forward as we all go forward together into a new normal. Thank you very much.